Okay, well, hello everyone, and today I am going to be discussing the culture industry, but first I would like to thank Christina for graciously agreeing to film me today so that you can all watch this. And so I want to talk about this concept of the culture industry, which is this kind of critique of modern society that talks about how the ideas of Marx and Freud and a few of the other theorists that we've been talking about in class so far are also connected to our modern lives and how they're connected to the ways that we're operating in the 20th and the 21st century. So, let's first define this term of the culture industry. And this term was first coined by a man named Theodore Adorno in 1947, and he calls it the industrial political creation of cultural products such as film, radio, art, etc., things like that. And it's the creation of these cultural products that are used to subordinate the masses. So this is the creation of mass culture, but not from the masses themselves. It's kind of a top-down system of cultural, subordination, if you will. And so this culture industry mass produces and distributes cultural goods to cultivate false psychological needs that can only be met with the products of capitalism, so the consumer objects that we buy in our modern society. So this really destroys the individual and absorbs him into this mass society that we live in today. So this is a way of kind of perpetuating capitalism. So in a lot of ways, I'm going to be talking about art and culture and things like that, but it's also related to industry and kind of economics and things like that. So this is kind of the colonization of the cultural sphere by industry. So the earliest origins of the culture industry, or this concept of the culture industry, come from the writings of Karl Marx back in the mid-1800s, where he talks about the alienation of labor. And this is where he talks about when the powers of industry and the Industrial Revolution have made it possible so that people aren't producing and consuming the same things. People are buying consumer goods that they haven't made themselves anymore. And so this is a very new thing in the 19th century. And so people are creating more and more things thanks to advanced machinery and technology, but at the same time, these objects are becoming devalued. So the more you make, the less each individual thing is worth by itself. And so later on in the early 20th century, theorists started noticing the same things were going on in the realm of culture and kind of in society. And so in the mid-1920s, a lot of theorists in Germany started noticing this very specifically. And one of the first ones to do this was a man named Siegfried Krakauer. And so he, in a book called, or an essay rather, called The Mass Ornament in 1927, really notices how mass culture seems to be very similar to the assembly line, or kind of these things that Henry Ford and other industrialists have been imposing on the economy. And so in this essay, he talks about how the assembly line for cars looks a lot like the Rockettes or other kind of things like that. And so he uses this term, the mass ornament, to describe kind of how, he says it's kind of how this mass culture is becoming faceless, and there's nothing more that's unique anymore in our cultural realm, and how it's kind of taking over from the individual. Now we just have this mass-produced culture where everything is kind of the same in a lot of ways. And he sees this as kind of the culture of Western societies reflecting the changes that are going on in the capitalist structure of our industry. So he's saying that, the production of some consumer goods such as cars or radios or clothing or anything like that is just the same as the cultural production of the things that we're viewing and watching. And so that's kind of where he goes. And so this is one of the earliest references to this idea of the combination of culture and industry, which will later, in the 40s, really become a very significant term in a lot of ways. So, in the 1930s, though, before this, mass culture is increasingly being observed by people, and they're seeing how governments and other things besides just industry are also appropriating mass culture. And so the rise of Nazi Germany is a really influential part of this. And so Walter Benjamin is one of the really big people in this movement who talks about how, in his piece, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, how mass culture is being made by the masses. It's not being made by the masses anymore. It's being made by the people at the top, so the businessmen and the presidents and the generals and the people at the top of our society, and it's being imposed in a top-down kind of way to the masses. And so, in The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which is written in 1936, Benjamin talks about how art is now being produced for a mass audience, and so it becomes commodified. It's an object of consumption instead of just, the work of art in kind of the pre-industrial era where it was made for individual reflection. It was made for the individual viewer to reflect on and become absorbed into this work of art. But now, in the 20th century, when art is being mechanically reproduced, it's being absorbed into our mass culture, and it's just becoming part of our society instead of us being absorbed into it. And so he calls this this authenticity that original art has, he calls it the aura, and he says that when you reproduce art, this aura becomes destroyed in a lot of ways. And so when a piece of art becomes a commodity and kind of a copied object, it loses this kind of originality and uniqueness and authenticity that it has. So that's kind of, in the 30s, they're seeing, especially a lot of art and a lot of film and kind of propaganda in a lot of ways that Nazi Germany is using, and they're noticing that these same things are going on in mass culture as well. But it's not just art that these theorists are talking about. They're also noticing how art is not only being massively reproduced, but it's also being communicated and spread very quickly. And so this is especially apparent with radio, which is becoming a really booming and new big technology in the 1930s. And so one person who really did a lot of studies on radio is a man named Rudolf Arnheim, who in 1936 also publishes this book called Radio and Art of Sound. And in this he talks about how radio can create worlds composed entirely of sound, how when you listen to the radio, you can become completely absorbed into it, and you can kind of become totally dominated by a radio program. So one example that he points to is the famous H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds broadcast, which is done by Orson Welles in 1938, I think. And so in this, he's talking about how people become totally fooled by the radio, and they think that it is real life, even though this isn't real life. It's very clear that this is a work of fiction, but at the same time, people believe that the War of the Worlds broadcast was a real thing in a lot of ways. And so Arnheim argues that, kind of like how we've been talking before about how people are becoming alienated in culture, now radio is also doing the same thing, where we aren't even thinking for ourselves anymore. We can't even tell what's real and what's not. And so radio is just dominating us and telling us what is real, and it's kind of creating our own worlds for us. And so he also says in this book that radio isn't perfect yet, but he kind of sees this trajectory, and that radio will eventually become perfect, and so that when we listen to the radio, we won't even use our own imaginations anymore to imagine kind of the reality of the radio programs we listen to, but we'll just become totally subordinated and sedated by this radio and these other cultural technologies that are coming about in the 20th century. And so I think this is a really important theme of the culture industry, the idea that people are becoming subordinated and that the individual is becoming part of the masses, and he's not really remaining an individual anymore. So people are losing their individuality. And so in a lot of ways, this is what leads us to the idea of the culture industry, which is a term first coined by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer in 1947. And so the theorists that I've been talking about before, so Krakauer and Benjamin and Arnheim, they were all Germans who were living in Germany during the rise of the Nazi government. And so they notice all these things that are going on with the Nazis in culture. But then, after World War II and after the defeat of the Nazis, a lot of these theorists come to the United States, and they see the exact same things are going on in the United States that they saw in Germany. So maybe they're starting to think that maybe this isn't just something that is part of a totalitarian state or a fascist state. Maybe this is something that is a universal thing, at least in Western society. So they're seeing that in the United States, just like they saw in Nazi Germany, that the political and economic forces of the state have colonized the cultural sphere from kind of this top-down way again. And they're saying that in the United States, maybe that our culture industry isn't quite as politically oriented maybe as you would see in Germany, but at the same time, it's perpetuating and promoting the capitalist society that we live in the United States. And so in a lot of ways, it's saying that entertainment and art, and especially advertising, also motivate people to act in a certain way and follow a specific mode of behavior in kind of the face of these dominating economic forces. And so, so we see this in film, and we see it in radio, and we also see it in a lot of ways in advertising, which it kind of, in a lot of ways, is compelling people to feel like they need to buy products and engage in consumerism, even though they might not have to, even though people can sometimes see through the messages of advertising and through the messages in film and other pieces of art, they still buy into it and they still perpetuate the system. So what Adorno and these other people have realized at this point is that Marx said back in the 1800s that when people have the power of consumerism, when people have the economic power to buy objects, that they'll be able to overthrow the capitalist system and kind of create this new socialist or communist world. But these Frankfurt School people like Adorno are saying that no, actually, people have the power of consumerism, but nothing's changing. We're still being dominated by these, kind of elite economic and political forces, so that capitalism is going to perpetuate itself. So they're saying that what Marx said was wrong, and that the reality of the 20th century is actually saying that Marx maybe didn't have everything right. So we need to adapt Marx's readings and things like that to the technology and the realities of the 20th century. So later on, Adorno also wrote on leisure time and kind of the ideas of what we do in our free time. And so his one essay, Free Time, which was published posthumously in 1977, really talks about this a lot, where free time, which is kind of what we do on our weekends and our time off from work, should in theory be the exact opposite of work time. So it should be kind of when we're at work, we don't have our own freedom of our own time because we're working and we're being paid to work. So in theory, then our weekends should be time off and should be time where we're completely free. But Adorno is saying this isn't really the case because we're still, we engage in consumerism and consumption in our time off, and we're still engaging and participating in the capitalist society, so that in a lot of ways, the culture industry has even kind of taken over our free time, so we're never actually truly free anymore. And this is kind of still talking about how Marx might have gotten it wrong in a lot of ways. So Adorno is noticing that things like that we do in our free time, like camping, well, you can't go camping unless you buy your products, like your tent and your things like that, from a store. So you have to engage in capitalism, engage in consumerism. You can't go to the beach and do these other things without engaging in consumerism. So that's what he really talked, and I think this essay is a really important way of understanding how the idea of the culture industry is that it's spreading. It was originally an economic force, an industrial force, and now it's coming into our art, it's coming into our culture, now it's even coming into our free time. And so this might seem like it's a really negative thing in that we're being completely subordinated by the culture industry, but at the same time Adorno talks about how this isn't a complete and 100% total takeover. He also admits in this piece that although we're really being subordinated by these messages that are coming from the culture industry and from industry, a lot of times people don't understand the messages, or they don't respond to them in the right way, or the way that the culture industry would like us to. And so he really proves this by he did a lot of empirical analysis on his own of people and how they responded to different messages and events that came through the culture industry. And so I think this is another really important part about the culture industry, where a lot of the theorists and people who helped create this idea also added empirical analysis, and so they could actually prove these theories that they introduced with hard data and hard facts. And so some other people who did this back in the 1940s were two scholars from the University of Columbia, Robert Merton and Paul Lazarsfeld, who did a lot of research into the ways that people actually listen to radio and how they actually watch television and things like that. And so one thing that they noticed was they created this term, narcotizing dysfunction, where they talk about how audiences really, they become, because we're being kind of sedated or kind of overwhelmed with so many messages now in our modern society, where messages and culture can be mass reproduced and can be mass communicated so quickly, so that today in our modern society we're seeing messages of a variety of things at a very rapid rate, a very constant rate. But they're saying that when we see so many messages in our society from the culture industry and from the state, that this actually makes us less active. And so the more messages we see, the less we're actually likely to respond to them in any constructive way. So they're saying that in our modern society, people have replaced actually doing something with just knowing about it. So it's like, if I'm having social or economic issues, because I know about them and I can talk about them, it makes me feel like I'm actually doing something about it, where I'm not actually changing anything. But they're saying that this is another way that the culture industry is perpetuating itself by overwhelming people with these messages so that they're not actually doing anything to change it. So this is another thing that they were noticing way back in the 1940s. Okay, so the overexposure of these messages kind of changes people so that they can't actually change the capitalist society that they live in any meaningful way. So this culture industry lives on in a lot of ways. So recently, in the past few decades or so, a lot of historians have really been influenced by this idea of the culture industry that's been introduced. And they've gone back and they've seen how it has actually been present in our society for at least the past 120 years or so, and how the messages and kind of the ways that culture has been created and fashioned in our modern society has done a lot to kind of dominate us and to create or make certain modes of behavior the only acceptable ways of participating in society. The things that mass culture does is it makes the individual is destroyed. You can't really live in our society anymore unless you participate in mass society anymore. You'll become alienated from society unless you kind of follow these different things that mass culture is trying to impose on us. And so I think that this film, it's called Uncle Josh with the Moving Picture Show, is a really good way of understanding the ways that industry and the culture industry is dominating us. So this film, which came out in 1908, came at a time where normally, or at least in the early years of film, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, people would go to the movies and they would talk and they would stand up and they would yell at the film and they would participate. And this is a very public sphere kind of place. And this film, along with a lot of others that come out in the early 1910s or so, are kind of showing people how not to act. So this is a comedy film, and this man, Uncle Josh here, is kind of this country bumpkin who he's very foolish, and he thinks that this film is real, and so he thinks it's funny, and so he gets up and he tries to dance with this woman. And so in this next scene, he's going to see a train come at him, and he's actually going to believe that this train is a real thing, and that it's going to run him over, so he runs back and hides in his seat. So the way that this film is kind of imposing the correct way to watch a film is actually it's very serious, and even though this is a piece of comedy, it's actually kind of imposing the correct way to watch a film. You need to sit in your seat, you need to be quiet, you need to reflect on the film. You shouldn't be talking to your neighbors in the other seats around you or anything like that. So this is kind of the ways that the culture industry through film is taking the movie theater, which used to be a public space where people could form sexual or ethnic or socially diverse groups, and it's taking it into this mass place where people are all together and they're all silent. It's this kind of homogenized mass group, and so film is really changing. And so in this last scene, Uncle Josh gets angry at what he sees in the film, and so he actually tries to attack the people because he thinks they're real, and he doesn't even realize once he's torn the screen down that he was actually watching a movie. He thinks what he's seen is real life, which is why he attacks the cameraman at the end. So this is kind of showing the ways that film and these other pieces of the culture industry are really dominating us and imposing their will on us in a lot of ways. And so this film and a lot of others were analyzed by a historian named Miriam Hansen in 1991, where she talks about, in her book Babel and Babylon, how the film industry did a lot of really specific ways of imposing its will on us. And so this is also a thing which you can see, and this is another film that I put in the suggested films to watch. This is a cartoon from the 1930s, which is it shows this foolish country couple who comes to the city, and they witness kind of the inner workings of capitalism. And by the end of the film, they're no longer these foolish country bumpkins, and they come out looking just like everybody else in modern mass society, and they buy a car and they buy technology and they engage in consumerism. So this is kind of another film that I think is a really good way of showing how the film industry is showing people that capitalism is the only way to survive in our modern society, and it's kind of forcing people to accept and buy into the capitalist system. And the last thing I want to talk about is another book that came out recently in 2004, is Prosthetic Memory. And so in this, the historian Alison Landsberg talks about how film and monuments and other pieces of culture are also imposing their own ideas on us. So through things like Schindler's List and Gone with the Wind, we're having ideas of what the Holocaust and what the antebellum South and the Civil War were like, and these ideas of history are being imposed on us through culture. So we're not actually creating our own ideas about history anymore, our own memories. They're being imposed on us from these cultural pieces and things like that. And so the Vietnam Memorial, I think, is another way of, we think of the Vietnam War as a sad and somber thing, and it's kind of reinforced through these cultural products like the Vietnam War Memorial, where This might not be the actual case. I mean, I don't think we can actually assign one emotion to a historical event like this, but the ways that these cultural products are kind of imposing their own memories on us is another way that the culture industry exists today, and how it's still imposing its own will on us and making us act in different ways that we wouldn't do on our own without this culture industry. And so that is all I have today, so I hope this makes sense. I think that this is a very interesting topic that I hope you'll all find interesting too. But I think the big point is that a lot of these things, like the culture and stuff, most of the things I talked about took place in the early part of the 20th century, and so that it's easy to think that these things don't happen anymore. But I would argue that in a lot of ways that they do. Like things like film and radio and art in a lot of ways are still present with us today, and they're still affecting us in a lot of ways. So things aren't really very different today from the ways that they were in the early part of the 20th century, when Marx and Adorno and these other people were noticing the effects of industrialization on culture in our modern Western society. And so that's it.